Welcome back. I'm Doug Miles, and along with Dennis Maley, the editor of the Bradenton Times, we're here to talk about some of the constitutional amendments on the November 2nd ballot. I know a lot of the voters out there may have some questions about it. I know I did when I got the ballot in the mail recently. And Dennis, you're the man that kind of follows this even closer than I do. People do have some questions, though, about these.
It's a lot to follow.
The language can be confusing,
Absolutely.
Right?
It's a lot to follow. And I can tell you that from our readers and voters that I talk to, there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding. A lot of people are confused about what the amendments actually will do. And that's a problem when you're operating with a direct democracy like this. You know, Florida does have kind of a streamlined process to amend its constitution, which, you know, different people will argue whether that's a good or bad thing. But, you know, you do get to certain points and certain issues where people or groups of people have decided that they haven't gotten the sort of response from the representatives that they'd hoped for, and that becomes kind of a last repose for them to instigate change. But you're right in the sense that is a tremendous amount of misinformation out there. That's really part of the problem, because you've got special interests on both sides of it who are kind of advertising their position and their slant on it, and very little of just real information. That's what we hope to provide the voters so that they can make an informed decision.
And one of the things, whenever an amendment is put on a ballot, the language of the amendment is sometimes written in a way where you're not quite sure if you're voting yes on it or you're voting against it, or vice versa, right?
That's true. And, you know, it's only the first part of the process, as we've learned with Amendment 8, specifically the class size amendment, is that once the amendment's put into place, then it's just really to create the legislation. Now, the legislation, that amendment's 75 words of kind of a general promise, but the legislation itself is what really affects how it comes out and affects the voter and the citizen. So really the first part of that process is just whether or not they believe in it, but it's really up to the legislator then to enact it in a way that's meaningful, and that doesn't always happen. So it's a little more complicated than even just the vote itself.
It may change down the road. Even if it's passed, that legislation may be slightly different.
It's passed in a concept, but then it's up to how do we actually implement that. And a lot of that, because of the vagueness of a 75-word amendment, a lot of that is up to the legislator in that process.
Let's go over some of the more controversial amendments. I know amendment number 4, you see signs all around.
That's definitely been the one that's got the most
one,
traction, absolutely. And that's the one that we get the most input from our readers on. That's the one that people seem to be the most emotional about. And I think it's because it's an extreme amendment. You know, it's an opportunity for people to vote directly on the biggest changes to their community. That being said, there is a tremendous amount of misinformation on this amendment. I have met very few everyday voters who have a grasp of this. And it's not because they're ignorant. It's not even because they're not going out and seeking that information. It's just that there's too much misinformation that exists. What you have with Amendment 4 is the idea that comprehensive land plan changes, a comp plan to every community, the comprehensive changes that are approved by the commission would have to kind of be ratified by the voters at the next scheduled election. Now, I've heard things in different sorts of advertisements and communications, electioneering communications, very extreme, like, oh, well, if I put an addition on my house, voters would have to vote on across the county. It's simply not true. What we're talking about, every county has a comprehensive land use plan. What we're talking about is anytime this is amended, and that's a big deal. You know, this is a long-term 20, 30-year plan on how the voters want their community to look.
Right.
When that's amended, that's a serious thing. They're saying, hey, we should have voters ratify this. Now, how that's come to be an issue is because voters feel, and citizens group feel, they're not getting the results from their boards, their county commissions in particular. They're not getting their voice heard, and they say, hey, listen, if we can show up at a meeting and we could have 300 or 400 people sign a petition saying we don't want this to happen, and in many cases a planning board say it's a bad idea, and a commission still votes for something that a developer wants to amend that comp plan, where else do we go? And that's what you have. You have these amendments. You have these extreme reactions to a situation where they're not getting their issue heard, they feel, on that low level.
Yeah, there's a big feeling out there among the citizens that we've already built too much already. Let's slow it down, and I think that's what a lot of people are thinking.
There is, and there was an article about a week ago in the New York Times, and they weighed in on it. So it shows you the kind of traction this is getting, because this amendment's been passed in several states. They call it the Hometown Democracy Act. This has been passed in several states. Now, Florida's one that's kind of a unique situation because of our development problems. And one of the things that I think they kind of encapsulated well in that article was the idea that everybody's looked at the banks, everybody's looked at the mortgage brokers and said, okay, we've gotten this real estate bubble and we've got all these problems from overdevelopment now, but nobody's really pointing the finger and saying none of that happens unless you have this kind of unchecked, unplanned growth. And they kind of highlighted a bunch of communities in Florida where you've got maybe 30, 40% of the condominiums sitting vacant and in foreclosure, and these people are saying, look, this isn't what we wanted for our community. I don't want to live around a whole bunch of high rises, a lot of them sitting vacant, and I don't want to deal with the cost that pushes back on the taxpayer. Let's face it, this doesn't really always pay for itself. They always say growth pays for itself. We found that's not true.
No.
A lot of that falls back to those cozy relationships between the developers and those county commissions, and those kind of unchecked, unsmart growth getting pushed forward.
Now, I think people may not quite understand that there's still plenty of building allowed on the plan already. So that's not going to automatically stop building
Absolutely.
if this passes, right?
Absolutely. If you're talking just about a zoning change, that wouldn't even be a factor here. And there are still just tons of comp plans that are already been amended.
The project's already on the books.
They're already there. They can do that. So it's not going to have the impact on development that the people who are in favor of it say that it's going to have. It's not. You're not going to see building in Florida grind to a halt.
Tractors aren't going to go down 75 the other way, then.
No,
Okay.
Not going to happen. They're still going to be able to build houses for a very long time.
I think people may think, though, if they vote to pass this, well, all building is going to stop.
It will have no discernible impact for decades to come on the amount of houses that are built. What it will say is that if I want to take a piece of land that in our comp plan is supposed to be one house per acre, and I want to say, hey, I want to develop this completely different, and I want to go into your community, and I want to put maybe 3 and put smaller lots up, or maybe 6 or 8. I want to put condo buildings right around your nice community, and that's not in the comp plan now, and the board approves it. Because remember, if the board approves it, it's dead in the water. Or excuse me, if the board votes it down, it's dead in the water. But if the board approves it, it's going to go on the next regularly scheduled election, so there won't be any special election costs associated with that. It's going to go on the ballot on the next election, and the voters will have to approve it.
Yeah. Going to be interesting to see what happens. Passion on both sides.
Absolutely. And make no mistake, Doug, this is a very extreme reaction. I mean, they're right when they say we do have representative government. This isn't a direct democracy, and there are problems that come with a direct democracy. Let's be honest. Not every voter is going to be educated enough or understand or even know where some of the issues are that they're voting on. Now, the hope is that if they don't, they're just going to not vote, and you'll have the interests that be kind of vote their position on it.
Right.
But again, extreme reactions come when the prescribed path doesn't work. So I think that the people in government who point back and say, well, this is extreme, this is a problem, they really have to look in the mirror and say, how did we get here? And I think they have to look at themselves for that answer.
Yeah, going to be interesting to see. Let's move on to Amendments 5 and 6, the Fair District Amendments, which would be for both the legislature and for legislative redistricting and congressional redistricting. That's easy for me to say. But it would kind of put a clamp on what many people think is gerrymandering, right? Absolutely.
This is by far my favorite amendment, and it's because you really can't find an honest answer against it. And, I try to keep an open mind, and I've talked to a lot of people and read it up and down, but I look at it, and in my opinion, gerrymandering, and it's just carving up of districts where politicians are choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their politicians, that is probably the single biggest impediment to democracy that there is, maybe right along with campaign finance reform. So you have an opportunity right now to kind of go in there and X one of them out and say, listen, from now on, we're not going to have a district like District 55 in Manatee County, which goes from St. Pete down into, goes through Bradenton into Sarasota. we're not going to have our legislative districts carved up by whoever's in power, whether it's Republicans or Democrats. We're not going to have it carved up to say, hey, how do we keep control of the House and the Senate for the longest possible time? Right. But we're going to have communities and we're going to have districts that reflect, a proportionate amount of people, but in a community that has the same kind of interests and that are going to go to one place and get representation. That hasn't happened, and I really can't find a downside to this amendment. In fact, there was another one that was put on that was struck down by the Florida Supreme Court because it was an effort to kind of undermine this. There was an effort that the court said was confusing, and it was the legislature's way of trying to protect that power. And I think that, more than anything, is proof of why we need an amendment like 5 and 6. Again, it's a little bit confusing. 5 does it for the state, okay, and 6 does it for your congressional districts. So if these pass, that will kind of be in one fell swoop an opportunity for voters to say, we want, at reapportionment, redistricting, every 10 years that happens after the census, we want that to happen in a fair way that reflects our community, not just a way that protects the politicians that are in power.
Difficult to kind of extract from that because the party in power, no matter what they are, likes it the way it is, right?
Absolutely. You look at it. Really, the system we have now is created by political machines to protect political machines. And any political machine, no matter what side of the ideological spectrum it's on, political machines by nature thwart democracy. I mean, they don't really want public involvement. They want to kind of control what they're doing.
Keep what's already working.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is going to work, and it's going to continue to be there. This won't get rid of political machines, but when you have the legislature actually have the power and the ability to say, I want these people in this box voting for me because they happen to be from my party, you really don't have representative democracy. You have that kind of just power structure where the people in power are going to remain in power, and you're going to have more things like Amendment 4 come up because people are going to say, hey, I don't have representation. So again, this is another one of those issues when you have these extreme responses, that's why.
And I think people now that are fed up with government, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or whatever, I think they're going to be interested in this amendment, and I think they may go for it.
Absolutely. This is one that I'm going to keep a close eye on, but my prediction, this is going to pass in a landslide because there's it's a hard case to make to say we should be able to keep gerrymandering our districts to our, I'm going to be
using that
interested
word in the amendment, which is interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's one of those things where it's been going on forever. It's been accepted as kind of a part of the way we do business. But here's an opportunity. Here's a good example of the amendment. The ease of amending a state constitution is really working in citizens' favor because absent of this is why you'll never see it on a federal level, because absent of the ability of the voters to do this directly, you're never going to have the people that benefit from that power give that power up.
No, why would they?
Absolutely.
It'd be at work.
That's where you have one of the few instances. Yes, it's a little bit messy, and there's a lot of people that are constitutionalists that believe, hey, you have this sacred document, and it really should be only changed in the most extreme, very, very few instances. Here's an example where I got to look at it as a way that it's working in favor of the people.
Let's move on to amendment number 8, the repeal of the class size amendment. I know, Dennis, you interviewed one of the candidates for the school board. I believe she was in favor of it. It is still a controversial amendment, though, isn't it?
It's a tricky issue. Here you had a candidate who espoused a very popular view of it, which is it's not being done right now, and this is kind of the only solution available. So even though they're not saying this is really good for education, they're saying that the implementation of the First Amendment, let's be clear, what Amendment 8 does is it repeals the class size amendment that was previously passed. And it doesn't remove it blanketly. There's a lot of people that I talk to that say, well, I don't want that. You'll have 40 or 50 people in a class size. It doesn't do that. It just it kind of repeals it, but keeps the class size averages that were implemented in slowly. So you had a situation where they said you had to average so many students in a class. This year was the first year where they had hard caps on the amount of people in the class and fines and penalties for not meeting them. And there were so many challenges, and it's not helped by our budget situation right now. There were so many challenges to meeting that, and it's costing schools who are paying these fines because they're looking at it. I had one superintendent tell me, look, it's going to cost me $4 million to come into full compliance or $300,000 in fines. My hands are tied what I can do when I'm already facing these budget constraints. Right. So you can see that problem. But when you look back on it, why we're here again is that we passed an amendment, and this is the important part about these amendments. They're not silver bullets. We passed an amendment that said we authorize the legislature to come up with legislation that will implement class size amendments, or excuse me, class size limits. That was passed. It was implemented poorly. It wasn't funded correctly, and now you're in a situation where it's not working. Those same people who didn't are the ones behind saying, let's repeal it, let's repeal it. So you really have a catch-22 here, because you have a lot of hardliners who are saying, look, the amendment's not the issue. It's the legislation that was enacted because of it. And that's what, and you have the power to go back and change that. It should be funded correctly, and it should be changed at the legislature level. That's not going to happen, the other side will tell you. So you really have a catch-22 where you have a situation that's not working. It's probably the legislature's fault that it's not working. The solution right in front of us is let's repeal it. It's probably going to happen. We're probably not in a situation to do anything else about it right now, but it's really not as black and white as we'd like it to be.
They're voting for it before they voted against it. Is it one of those kind of situations?
One of those things again. Really the important thing here, though, is, Doug, is, hopefully we've provided some baseline information to help people really understand what these amendments do. And they can find out more by going to www.thebradentontimes.com, going to our voter guide and looking at the amendments. But the important thing is that they go out and they exercise their right to participate in democracy, and they vote on November 2nd.
And we appreciate you for joining us today. For Dennis Maley, I'm Doug Miles saying thanks for watching. We'll see you again real soon.